If you want to manage your minerals like the pros, you need to know the answer to these 4 questions about your oil and gas lease. This is part 3 of our series on minerals management, and we're talking about how to get organized, all the operative documents that impact your mineral rights, and how to build your own minerals management file. So stay tuned and learn something. Howdy folks, welcome back to the Minerals Guy channel. On this channel, we share tips on mineral management, mineral valuation, and how to achieve maximum value for your mineral rights. If you're getting value from our content, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons so that you get notified when we post new videos. For those of you new to the channel, my name is Stephen Hatcher and I'm the creator of Minerals Guy. I acquire and manage mineral assets for a living. I'm also an oil and gas attorney with over a decade of experience buying, selling, and developing oil and gas properties all across the country. I created Minerals Guide to provide tailored content and resources to oil and gas mineral and royalty owners just like you, with the goal of educating and empowering them to understand more about minerals as an asset class. We also help mineral sellers to retire, send kids to college, get out of debt, take risk off the table, and to pursue the things in life that mean the most to them. If we can be a service to you or someone you know, you can schedule a consultation on our website, mineralsguide.com. But regardless of whether you're interested in selling, we want to be your go-to resource for all things mineral rights. In this series, we're talking about minerals management and how to manage your mineral rights like the pros. In this episode, we're talking about the second document to add to your minerals management file, your oil and gas lease. And we're gonna help you answer 4 questions that every mineral owner should know about their lease. So let's dive in. Part 1, your oil and gas lease. Now, if you've owned your minerals for a while, there's a pretty good chance that you've negotiated and executed an oil and gas lease in the past. And you may be saying to yourself, Stephen, I've already got a copy of my lease. That's great, you're ahead of the game, but keep watching. Now, let's say you're a new mineral owner. Maybe you just inherited a piece of property that's subject to an oil and gas lease that dates back 20, 30, or even 50 years. That's right, many folks don't realize it when they sign, but oil and gas leases can last for a really, really long time. And this is my first pro tip of the day for folks contemplating executing a new oil and gas lease. It's easy to get excited when a landman knocks on your door and tells you that an oil and gas company wants to drill a well on your land. After all, oil and gas has created life-changing wealth for many landowners. But before you just sign the lease form that the landman hands you, I want you to burn a timeout and proceed with caution. Oil and gas leases are complex, and like I said before, they can last for a really, really long time. So this may be your one chance to get it right, and remember that your kids, your grandkids, may have to live with this document for decades. So what if you don't have a copy of your oil and gas lease? You lost it, you've never seen it, whatever. Like source deeds, which we discussed in episode 2, oil and gas leases have to be recorded in the public records of the county or parish where the property is situated in order for them to be effective against third parties. And that is where you're going to find a copy of your lease. We spent a good bit of time in episode 2 talking about how to find your source deed in the public records. So if you need to find your oil and gas lease, go back and watch episode 2. So what is an oil and gas lease? An oil and gas lease is an agreement between a mineral owner or lessor and an oil company or lessee, where the mineral owner grants the oil company the right to extract minerals from a piece of property. The oil and gas lease defines the rights and obligations of the parties in relation to drilling and production of oil and natural gas from the property at issue. And there are many notable provisions of an oil and gas lease. The granting clause, which defines the scope of the lease, the habendum clause, which defines the duration of the lease, the royalty clause, which defines the royalty you will receive and how it will be calculated, and other clauses such as the pooling clause, which defines how your lease may be pooled with others in order to form units, and other clauses such as pooling provisions, cessation of production provisions, and force majeure. The list goes on and on. Now, we aren't going to cover all of these clauses, or this would be a really long video, but we are going to help you answer 4 questions. Who, what, when, and how much. Part 2, reviewing your oil and gas lease. So the first question to answer is who are the parties to the lease? Now, as we already mentioned before, an oil and gas lease is between two parties, the mineral owner or the lessor and the oil and gas operator or the lessee. And the lessor and the lessee are going to be named in the very first paragraph of the lease. So who is the lessor? Well, as the mineral owner, you are the lessor. And if you executed the oil and gas lease, your name should be right up top. But what if the person listed isn't you? It could be a parent, a relative, or some other person. Regardless of who the person is, that person is known as an ancestor in title, meaning that they owned the property before you did and at the time of execution of the lease. In that case, if the oil and gas lease is still active, then you would have acquired the property subject to that existing oil and gas lease. So who is the lessee? The party named as lessee in your lease could be an oil and gas operator, it could be a land brokerage company, or even an individual. It's going to be whoever acquired the lease from you or your ancestor in title. Now, it may also be the case that the party listed as the lessee in your lease is not the current lessee of the property. Similar to land transactions, oil and gas leases are bought and sold quite frequently. And oil and gas leases are transferred via instruments called assignments. And these assignments are going to be recorded in the public records in the same place where you'll find your source deed and your oil and gas lease. So the next question to answer is what property is covered by your oil and gas lease? Now, in most cases, the property that's covered in your oil and gas lease is going to be the same property listed in your source deed. But it's also possible that the lease could cover only a portion of your property. Now, where is the property description located in your oil and gas lease? It could be in two places. The first place to look is in paragraph 2 of the lease, which is just under the named lessor and lessee. But you also need to check to see if an Exhibit A is attached to the lease, because it could also be listed there. The next question to answer is when, and really this can be broken down into two questions. First, what is the execution date of the lease? When was the lease executed? And the second is, when does the lease expire? It's really easy to find the execution date of the lease. It should literally be on the first line of the lease. But the bigger question is, when does it expire? Now, the duration clause of an oil and gas lease, also known as a habendum clause, is typically located in the third full paragraph of the lease following the property description. And in most cases, it goes something like this. This lease shall remain in force for blank years and for so long thereafter as oil and gas is produced in paying quantities. Now, what we have to do is we have to break the habendum clause down into two parts. The first part is what's called the primary term, and is the part that says this lease shall remain in force for blank years. And the second part is what's known as the secondary clause, which is the second part of that sentence that says, and for so long thereafter as oil and gas is produced in paying quantities. Now, the primary term of the lease is going to run from the execution date of the lease for the number of years stated. For example, if the execution date of the lease is January 1 of 2020, and the lease is for a primary term of 3 years, then the lease would expire on January 1st, 2023. Now, most modern oil and gas leases are what are known as paid up leases, meaning that the operator is not required to do anything within the primary term of the lease. There are no yearly rentals to be paid, obligations to be performed, and the bonus payment that you receive at execution is effectively consideration for granting the lease during the primary term. So if the oil company chooses to do nothing, then the lease would expire at the end of the primary term, and you would be free to execute a new lease to a different party. Now, in order for the secondary term to come into play, the oil and gas has to do something. Namely, they have to establish production in paying quantities. So they have to drill a well on your lands or lands pooled with your lands and establish production. If production is established within the primary term or shortly thereafter, then the lease is going to remain in force for so long as a well continues to produce in paying quantities. So what does paying quantities mean? Well, we could do an entire video on that topic alone, but in short, what it means is that the lessee can profitably produce oil and natural gas from your well. Now, how long can the secondary term last? It can last as long as a well or wells continue continue to profitably produce, which is not an indefinite period of time because oil and gas wells deplete through time. But as we mentioned before, it could be for a really, really long time, sometimes upwards of 20 to 30 or even 50 years. It's also important to note that there are multiple savings clauses in the oil and gas lease that allow the lessee to maintain the lease in force in the secondary term in the absence of production. Examples include shut-in royalty provisions, continuous operations provisions, and force majeure provisions, to name a few. So the last question to answer is probably the most important question to every mineral owner, and that is how much am I going to be paid under the terms of my lease? And when we're talking about how much, we need to look at the royalty provision of your lease. Now, the royalty provision of your lease is typically in numbered paragraph 3. It's going to talk about the lessor's share of production to be paid as a royalty on any oil, natural gas, and potentially other minerals that are produced. The royalty provision goes into detail on how the royalty is calculated and what can be deducted from it. Now, historically, the landowner's royalty under an oil and gas lease was 1/8 or 12.5% of the oil and gas produced from a well. But with the advent of U.S. shale, lease royalty rates have increased substantially across much of the country. Now, your lease form may still recite a 1/8 royalty, but the Exhibit A to your lease may modify the lease form to provide for a higher royalty, for example, 20%. Now, how is your royalty calculated? In most cases, the landowner's royalty is going to be calculated at the well. And what this means is that any costs and expenses incurred by the operator after the oil and gas is produced to A, get the product ready for sale, so think processing and treating expenses, or B, to get the product to market, so think marketing and transportation expenses, is going to be deducted from your royalty. Now, depending on where you live and how much acreage you own, you may have what's called a cost-free royalty, meaning that the operator will not be able to deduct these gathering, processing, and transportation charges from your royalty. Now, we're going to show you exactly where these GP&T expenses are being deducted in your royalty checks when we cover check stubs, so be sure to stay tuned for that episode later in this series. So now that you can answer these 4 questions about your oil and gas lease, what's next? Well, next we need to talk about division orders. And typically when I receive a division order, it's a good day because it means that I'm about to start getting paid on a new oil and gas well. But we need to discuss what they are, what they mean for you as a mineral owner, and whether or not you should sign them. Stay tuned for just a few more seconds and you'll see a link to our episode on division orders coming up next. If you're getting value from our content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. If you have any questions for us, you can reach us on the website, mineralsguide.com. You can also reach me by email, steven@mineralsguide.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.